Founders Forum, episode 16.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Founders Forum. Today, we're going to be having a conversation amongst ourselves. Specifically, it's going to be me, Cole Snell, as usual, but then we're also going to be joined by Alec Beckman, who is the head of digital assets at Infineo. And the context is I was invited to give a presentation at George Gammon's event, The Rebel Capitalist. And so on this very podcast, the Founders Forum, we had George as a guest. And then after we were done recording, he mentioned, hey, Bob, if you can be in Orlando, May 12th through 14th, I got this event. One thing led to another. And so I ended up speaking here. And the three of us, so Cole and Alec, went to the conference as well. We stepped aside and recorded the following conversation, just giving our reactions. So just to give you a little bit of flavor of the conference, I'll just read it. I'm looking at the pamphlet right now. So George Gammon, again, is the host. And he says, welcome to the Rebel Capitalist Live, because the name of his show is The Rebel Capitalist. This event is aimed toward helping you build your wealth and thrive in today's crazy economic environment. I teamed up with some of the brightest money and personal freedom experts to bring you top-notch information straight from the pros. From renowned economists and top-performing money managers to influential real estate investors and successful entrepreneurs who value their personal freedom, they are ready and willing to share their wisdom and experience with you. Okay. So other guests were the constitutional lawyer Robert Barnes, real estate investor Jason Hartman, Ken McElroy is a big real estate investor. He's tied in with Kiyosaki of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Kiyosaki actually made a surprise visit. Like, he wasn't on the official roster, but he showed up, spoke a little bit from the stage. Lynn Alden, Jeff Snyder, who's big on the Eurodollar University. Some of you may know him. And then the sort of headliners to round out the event were Peter Schiff and Simon Black, the sovereign research Simon Black, if you're familiar with his work. So all in all, very fun event. And without further rambling from me, why don't we go ahead and jump right into the conversation that the three of us from Infineo had after our time at the conference. Okay, folks, we are sitting here in an undisclosed location in Orlando, Florida. I'm joined, as usual, by Cole Snell, but also we have a special guest, co-host, a triple threat today. We've got Alec Beckman, who's also on the Infineo team. So, Alec, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Why don't you just, so that again, because it's also, they don't even have a visual on you, just explain a little bit about what your role is on the Infineo team, and then we'll get into the festivities.
Sure. So I recently joined the Infineo team as the director of digital assets, essentially working on a lot of our Web3 initiatives, from Sound Token to Infineo X, and just providing support where I can within the organization.
Great. So why don't we just kick it off? Already in the sort of introduction, I would have explained to the listeners, they get an idea of the context here, but I'm just curious your guys' thoughts as we're sort of rounding the finish line here at the conference. What are your guys' reactions so far?
Pretty amazing. I mean, what an amazing group of people to be around. Rebel Capital and George Gannon has done an amazing job putting this together. I think for me, the most amazing thing is just to kind of be in a room of like-minded people. Like, you're just walking around the hallways of the hotel, the undisclosed location. You see people with these Rebel Capital badges on, and there's a kind of like a look like you're in a secret, like it's Fight Club. I think you described it as like Capitalist Fight Club or something. And we've got pretty big names. You got Schiff walking around, Kiyosaki's walking around, and everyone just kind of gets it. Alec, what comes up for you? What are your initial?
Yeah, so I was actually going to mention that the like-mindedness of the people here, but it's not like-mindedness where everybody's agreeing just to agree. It's people are critically thinking, and people are looking into concepts like infinite banking and understand things like whole life, which was really unique to me. But there was a lot of real estate. There was a lot of people who just were looking for freedom. It was just really cool to talk to a lot of people and see some of these bigger names, as you mentioned.
It is interesting you guys both mentioned that, because as you know, I've been to a lot of like libertarian type conferences, or like specifically Austrian economics, whereas I think the guiding principle is everybody here is an investor. So they're skeptical of the government. They don't like central banks. They're believers in sound money, things like that. But the reason they're here is not to like rah-rah team and get a sermon from the preacher. It's more like, what do I do with my money right now in this crazy environment? And because of that, there is an objective metric of success. And that's why some of the speakers disagree with each other. And that's welcomed. Whereas I've been to other places where it's more like, this is what our team believes, and let's cast aspersions on that team over there. Whereas here, people know, well, no, if you start thinking like that, you're going to end up losing a lot of money.
I just have to qualify one thing before we get into the guts of the content and programming and some of the stuff that we've heard over the weekend. I said Schiff and Kiyosaki. I have to say Murphy as well, because hanging out with this guy, Dr. Murphy, at this conference for me was one of the most interesting things. I mean, we're walking into the conference just before we get to the escalator to go down into kind of where the cocktail reception was. And Bob was like, wow, I wonder, like, it's not exactly my crowd, but I wonder how it, and within, like, as soon as we got to the escalator, the first guy that passed us stopped and he was like, Bob Murphy, oh my God, can I get a selfie? And then we just knew it was on. So yeah, let's go with Schiff, Kiyosaki, and Murphy. Alec?
And well, the funniest thing was I'm speaking to a few people and two people walked up to me at one point and they're talking and they're making small talk. And then they were like, by the way, can you introduce us to Bob Murphy? And I was like, absolutely. So it was,
You should have like held your hand up to your ear like you were, security, and like, oh, okay.
So as far as the content go, do you guys have, so you presented, so George went first, you went second yesterday, right off the top, kind of set the tone and some of the energy. Then you sat on a panel. And like, what did you think from a speaker? Maybe just for our listeners here today, kind of what did you speak about? And then what was your feel as a speaker with your experience and the audience?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I had asked George, and folks, this all actually, the reason we ended up here is because when we had George on this podcast you're listening to, Founders Forum, earlier, I think we were done recording, but he mentioned to me, hey, I got an event going on in Orlando soon. So that's how we all ended up here. But yeah, so I asked George, like, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, the stuff you've been doing with the banks, like mention that. But then he said, but other than that, whatever you're working on, whatever interests you. I knew the kind of conference this would be. And I knew like, I'm not going to get into and like tell people, this is the stock portfolio I recommend with the, it's got this kind of correlation and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's just not my thing. And I knew the crowd wasn't going to necessarily know who I was. So I thought I got to do some kind of out of the box that just wakes them and like, they're not going to forget what I said. So for a while, like, and I've done this for years, like with the reparations debate, just the quick synopsis, it'll go, one side will say, hey, taxpayers should pay reparations for slavery. And then the other side will say, well, gee, most of us have nothing to do with it. Why are we on the hook for that? And then the counter response is to say, well, it's because you're benefiting even if you didn't personally involved or your grandparents or whatever. So to me, the important thing to point out in that context is, no, slavery is such an inefficient system. Even like white people who weren't involved with it are poorer because of it. So I went through an argument there. And then I started talking about the artificial intelligence stuff. And it looked like, I'm sure to a lot of people, like, this guy is just bouncing around. What the heck? And so I went into a whole thing with ChatGPT and I had some kind of funny jokes or whatever. But then I said, so are the robots going to take over and enslave humanity? And the crowd just kind of looking at me. And then I said, not if George puts this talk online, right? And so, because I said the robots will have seen this talk and then realized, no, if we enslave humanity, that will make us poorer. And so I got a laugh out of that. So that was kind of the thing, though, I was going for. And yeah, so that was my rationale that I thought, I don't know this crowd, and I kind of got to wake them up and do something that good. And it worked. I had a bunch of people coming to me after saying, wow, I've never thought of that before. And like, oh, I saw one guy, you guys weren't with me last night, this older guy, his wife said, oh, is there? And she's very nice. And oh, we like your talk, whatever. And then she's like, Harold. I'm making up his name. I don't think it was Harold. And she turns him around and he sees him. He goes, oh yeah, I like your talk. He goes, you are losing me. You spent too long on this slavery stuff. The train was leaving the station, but then you caught me and I went, oh, this guy's brilliant. I see what he did there.
Yeah.
So he was really like, letting me have, like, he wasn't complimenting. He was telling me, you fumbled and you almost lost ruined the play, but then you made up for it.
Yeah, totally.
So it's hilarious.
I think for the listeners, what we might try and do, because I know it was all recorded and we'll try and, if we can, get it into the show notes of the podcast.
George said, he said he would give it to me. Yeah. So it might take a while to process and whatever, but it
was pretty fascinating. Like what Bob did was, it was actually really amazing where he kind of got, so this show is about Founders Forum. It's about, founders at some point are going to be asked to public speak. Mm-hmm. They're going to be asked to present. That's essentially what founders do, is they're pitching their thing. So Bob was out there pitching his thing. He was doing his thing and he took the audience on a journey. He talked about, he managed to bridge the economics of slavery, Chat GPT 3.5, Chat GPT 4, somehow into and then the host, the MC, got up afterwards, also was like, wow, I'm not sure you have brought that all together, but it was pretty amazing.
We appreciate that.
Yeah. So I think the message to the founder that's listening to this is preparation at the end of the day. I mean, you put a lot of preparation into that. Clearly, your slides were on point. Your message was on point. And I really think you set the tone for the rest of the event. And so do you have a general sense of what's going to kind of come out of this? Like, what do you think George wants to achieve out of, say, this Rebel Capitalist event? What do you think his intention of maybe having someone like you coming and presenting and speaking really is?
So I think what he's trying to do is assemble a forum where his followers can just see a range of opinions from people who are like-minded as the right way. But you guys are right. It's not unanimous. There are people that, some people think the dollar is going to crash. Other thought, no, actually, when this stuff hits the fan, investors are going to run to the dollar. You know what I mean? So like pretty different views, but yet all agreeing on the basic underlying scenario of where things are going, but just in terms of investment implications. So I think, he's trying to give people a wide range of opinion, but also unfiltered. And so that's something I was pleasantly surprised. Like the guy that we were on the panel with, Robert Barnes.
Oh, yeah.
This constitutional lawyer. He's like, among other things, folks, he represented Wesley Snipes when he got into trouble with the IRS. So, I mean, this guy has some serious clients. But we got on the panel and I was amazed. Like he was getting a lot of conspiracy theory stuff. I'm not saying that in a disparaging sense. I was just pleasantly surprised that he felt so I think I'm using that as a way to answer your question. I think George is trying to give a forum where people feel like they can speak freely to give actual legitimate advice to people and not, let me run it through the filter to make sure I don't, get in trouble.
Then we had a lunch with Robert Barnes. So we broke out for lunch, and Robert Barnes, we're mentioning his name a bunch of times because for listeners, I mean, you should look this guy up. He's pretty fascinating if you have any interest in history, constitutional law. He's some kind of a defense attorney, like of sorts. I'm not exactly sure what kind of law he practices, but we sat with him at lunch, and he basically spoke the entire time at lunch. I mean, he spoke for half an hour straight. Usually when you hear people speak, you can get really kind of blown out and glazed over. I was enthralled by what he had to say. So I listened to him on a panel with Bob for an hour, and then I sat at lunch listening to him again, and I felt like it was the best content I've heard all day. It's fascinating guy.
Just to be clear, make sure so what Cole is saying, we were all like just sitting at lunch, just a little table. There were like 6 of us sitting there. It was basically Barnes was like holding court and everyone would ask him stuff. But he wasn't pretentious. It wasn't because he thought everyone needs to listen to me. It was because everyone was so fascinated by what he was saying that they just kept asking him questions, because we all realized this is the best use of this half hour right now is to keep asking this guy questions. So
yeah, it was pretty amazing. So Alec, you have an expertise and a career in digital assets, securities, digitalization of securities in particular. So you haven't had, say, like Bob, like a lot of exposure, say to probably less exposure to this community. Like Bob's friends with George Gammon, a lot of the people on the panel and the people that are, the speakers at Rebel Capital. What comes up for you? What were your impressions? If someone were to walk up to you on the street and say, hey, Rebel Capital movement, what comes up for you?
Sure. So I think there was a lot of healthy skepticism around institutions. And my perspective really comes from the conversations that I had with a lot of the attendees. But I wasn't surprised to learn that most people were in crypto. I wasn't surprised to learn that most people were looking for ways to move outside of the banking system, which I think is a really nice thought. I think some of these people are a little bit more down the rabbit hole than I am, but it was really interesting to learn perspectives. I'll give you one example. Somebody came up to me and was talking about transhumanism. And I'm less familiar with that concept, but I know that it exists. So hearing these things, it's kind of opens my eyes to some new ideas, some new things that I can look into. But yeah, it was overall a really good conference. I think everyone was very welcoming, and there were a lot of really cool conversations that I was a part of.
So crypto, a lot of people are in crypto. You did a lot of networking. Alec was the guy at all the different cocktail receptions that was out there just on his own, shaking hands, meeting people, just being that true networker. Transhumanism and crypto. Maybe for the listeners.
Can you explain that? Because the listener might think that you meant like, oh, I would like to live forever. Let me look into that. Like the context being the throwaway. I mean, on the panel, I made a throwaway line, folks. George had asked me about the WEF and Klaus Schwab, and I was getting into that. And then I said, and some of his lieutenants are getting into even, and I said, like this Harari guy, he's like all into transhumanism and stuff. And I was kind of a throwaway line. And then some guys came up to me later and were like, yeah, we're looking into this. This is some crazy stuff those guys are plotting. So that's what Alec is.
Yeah, and it seems to be from their perspective, because I spoke to those same guys, it seems to be a little bit anecdotal. We know a couple guys who are very wealthy and have access to groups and people that typical people wouldn't. But essentially, the message around that was people who have access to resources and wealth that most people don't have are accessing essentially experimental ways to live longer, to de-age. Actually, Robert Kiyosaki spoke, and a lot of the latter half of his presentation was about de-aging and all the different things that he's doing to, he claimed that he was about 15 years younger, which he looked great. So I can't say that he's not.
Well, it was odd for me because when I ran into him, the first thing that came up for me is that I thought he looked old, truthfully. But that was just that. So maybe yeah.
Well, I think he's like 70 something.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I think he's like 76 or 74.
Yeah. Well, he's changed a lot of lives. I mean, he's clearly done a lot in his lifetime. He's clearly done a lot for the movement of people towards better financial solutions. And just to kind of, it's really interesting that, I mean, he's I would say, top 10, probably top 20 financial industry celebrity, I would say globally. You know, we're walking around the Rebel Capital group. Like how many people would you say are attending this event?
I mean, I would say at least 300. But other people were throwing around much bigger numbers, and I don't know what the official head count was.
I think 300 is about, that's what I would say as well. And so to see someone like Kiyosaki just kind of like here because he's interested in it. Like he wasn't actually a headline. He was a guest speaker. He wasn't a headline speaker.
Right. Yeah. He wasn't on the official thing, but he was here.
Well, I think how he got here, Ken McElroy, I think was the speaker, and he is a real estate partner of Robert Kiyosaki. And he pretty much said he was invited to speak at this and he didn't want to come alone. So he asked Robert to come with him and he agreed. And then he ended up being a guest speaker, which was awesome.
Yeah. It was like a surprise. It was like one of those, like I was in my room getting something and I got a text from Bob saying, hurry down, Kiyosaki's going on stage. So it was like, we have a surprise guest speaker.
It was Ken kind of did it dramatically. He was like, oh, and I didn't want to be by myself. Like you guys are like Alec is saying, and they brought him up and I was like, ah.
Yeah.
So it was kind of funny how they did it.
Yeah. Well, I felt like I got catfished by Kiyosaki. You know what catfishing is? No.
Oh, yeah.
Or like, if you like go to like a dating app and like you see a picture of a guy or a girl and you meet them in person and they don't like, because I've been looking at Kiyosaki's book that I have like on my, and I've been looking at his picture of when he was like 35 when he wrote the book. And then I run into the 74-year-old guy. I'm like, Kiyosaki, you just catfished me. So that's why my comment about him being old earlier, but he looks great. He's amazing.
So I want to ask you, Alec, do you have any, from your perspective and what you know, did it seem like the people are, they really, if they knew more, they should know about XYZ?
Well, I think that the thing that I would push onto people is the first thing that was spoken about yesterday, which was George Gammon. And this is not a new topic. He's talked about this many times, but the concept of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and kind of where that is going. And really, it's more of the potential of, I guess, the harm that it can cause to citizens in terms of freedom. I think that where it's leading towards is social credit scores. And George Gammon, he does talk about this a pretty decent amount. We talked about, I guess, people and governments wanting people really just to obey. And one of the ways to do that is if you can move everybody's deposits onto one balance sheet, which would be the Fed's balance sheet, then that's really dangerous for everybody. And it's not that all these banks don't have this information today. If you go and spend money at he used Chipotle and CVS as an example, they can see not to the granular level of exactly what you got, but they can see that you were there. But I think moving it onto the Fed's balance sheet with new tech breakthroughs like AI, it would be much easier to determine how people are using their money, what they're using it towards. And then if the wrong people are in power and they see that you're using your money for something that you don't like, they have the ability to actually lower your social credit score theoretically, which is something that exists in places like China. And that can be really detrimental for people. It can allow people, not to get mortgages based off merit or the ability to pay back, but rather whether the government thinks that you are a good citizen or not, which can be very subjective depending on who's in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because since I had, again, folks, I spoke right after George, so I was kind of like thinking about, what am I going to say? I was watching the crowd and went, but yeah, George's talk was very interesting. He was showing video, right? Like people had to scan their thumbprint to get into Disney World.
Yeah, just like 2 days ago.
Yeah, I mean, and this, like that's something that 15 years ago, people would have, privacy advocates would have warned, oh, a day is coming, blah, blah, mark of the beast. And people would have said, oh, yeah. But I mean, it really is happening before our eyes. And George made the point too about how all these people now, like, you need to have an app on your phone to do something, which I always found annoying. But his theory was that's partly because that forces everyone to always have a phone on them, meaning they're being tracked. So.
The thing that was really interesting for me about his talk about CBDCs specifically was like kind of the diversion tactics that are happening around it, where it's almost like the people that are trying to create social credit scores and they're tying the consequences and the negativity of social credit scores to CBDCs specifically is kind of like a bait and switch. He likened it to, like, say, starting a fire, kind of like in a town in like a prominent buildings where all the police and the ambulance and then you go and rob the bank because they're. So it's kind of the idea really is that he said you don't need CBDCs to achieve what they're saying CBDCs will do. So they're trying to get everyone to look at CBDCs when in reality, Bob, you pointed it out, it's just about if you want to go to Chipotle, you may have to put your fingerprint in, and that'll just become second nature. This next generation, and they're starting, if you think about it, they're starting at Disney with children sticking their like ET finger out so that it's just second nature to go to Chipotle, put your finger in, and then the IRS implements a point of sale system because they don't want to know how much you're buying or the volume that you're buying at Chipotle. They want to know, like, are you buying tofu or are you having beef on your burrito? And George suggested that, well, if you have beef on your burrito, your social credit score is less than if you had tofu because for some reason I think tofu is better than beef.
Well, yeah, for like the climate change stuff is like what the ostensible reason is. Yeah, it is right with starting with the kids because I remember like after 9/11 when they put in, all the, the TSA came in and all the body scanners and all that stuff. You take and I remember thinking later, like when my first son was born, and I remember thinking like he's gonna never know a time when you didn't have to take your shoes off to get on a plane. Whereas like to people my age, we knew that, oh no, it didn't used to be like this. Like they would kind of look in your bag half-heartedly. Like it wasn't this Checkpoint Charlie thing. And so for him, oh yeah, anytime you get on a plane, of course they strip search you. Like that's just how you need that to fly, right? Like, and so yeah, this younger generation, they're not going to realize, they're going to think it's normal. Of course they got to scan my thumb. Otherwise somebody could be pretending to be me just because they stole my phone. That would be crazy. So
like, Alec, what do you think when people think about CBDCs, like just generally in crypto and your generation, you're like mid-20s, right? And so when you're talking to people like your peers that aren't, say, our director of digital assets, you have a deep understanding of crypto, digital securities, et cetera. What do people think? Like when you're just out at a party and CBDC comes up, what do they think it is?
So CBDCs are interesting, and it is very counterintuitive to the ethos and what crypto represents because it's the centralization of using digital assets. When I talk about crypto, it's usually about the decentralization of digital assets and the ability to not be tied into the financial systems that exist, the institutions, the banks, the governments, but something that's completely independent of that, such as gold or silver. Obviously, there's correlation with how the markets move, and it's a tremendously liquid asset. But in terms of CBDCs, the technology is there, and it actually makes sense. It makes sense to have money backed by blockchain or currency backed by blockchain. It's very transparent. It's very easy. The ability to send cross-border payments is there. I think that the issue with CBDCs are going back to putting that power into one party. I think if some state or if some bank wants to issue their own currency or CBDC in this case, and that can pay for specific things, like for instance, I think about how you, Cole, had mentioned, what's it, Sandcoin in the Bahamas?
In the Bahamas, yeah.
Yeah, which sounds like a pretty positive example. But, if the wrong people get in power and they start to abuse the information and data that's coming in through the CBDC, that's where it gets dangerous. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope. But yeah, it's very different than crypto and where we started. I got into this in 2015, and back then CBDCs weren't really on the radar. This is a conversation that's really come up in the past couple of years. So
just to follow, like as you're bumping around, like people in your peer group, I use a stupid term, are they like, oh, hostile? Or is it like, oh yeah, I mean, it's just the digital age, and yeah, central banks, obviously it's get with the times, it's all gotta go digital.
Oh, there's a negative connotation with CBDCs with people that I speak with that have been in crypto or understand crypto.
Yeah.
I think that the danger is for people who don't use crypto. I think that this is something that makes a lot of sense because you hear a lot of the time oh, Bitcoin isn't great, but blockchain, the technology
Right.
behind it is. What makes Bitcoin great is and we can argue whether it's truly decentralized, but the idea that it's decentralized and that people created it, there was no mint where it was distributed to people. It was the first time that people were able to get Bitcoin was you had to have a miner and you had to verify the entire blockchain in this case.
If I was to take a guess, I would imagine that people that don't have a true, fully baked idea as to what a CBDC is think, and this is total conjecture. Like I really haven't done any research in this. I'm just kind of going out on a limb here. But I wouldn't be surprised, maybe it's a better way to put it, to think that, say, people that haven't studied CBDCs or crypto or digital assets, when they hear it marketed or they hear it spoken of, say, on Fox or CNN or like mainstream media, I tend to think that what their impression of it is that, oh, it's some kind of like deflationary or hedge or sound type digital token that's going to have all the pitfalls of fiat and it's going to be easy to get in and out of. And it's like Bitcoin for everybody. That's really easy to understand. Like for me, just to throw that out there, like, does that connect? Is that like, am I completely in left field with thinking that people might think that way?
Well, certainly, I don't know about the Fox people, but yeah, the way
Right.
they're
That's
marketing,
fair. Yeah, okay.
the
Not
way
that
they're
group.
marketing it definitely is. Yeah, I mean, it's a cool technology, but Bitcoin's like, that's like Wild West stuff. You want to have something safe and regulated where the government can ensure the integrity of the system. And that's why a central bank digital currency is the best of both worlds. You got the digital convenience and the oversight and regulations and protection for the consumer because it's issued by the central bank, not this, we can't control Bitcoin. We don't know what the heck's going on there. There could be drug dealers who use Bitcoin or, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With CBDCs, I think about two big problems with the dollar today and with fiat currency, and it solves one of the issues, but it makes one of them more difficult. The one that it solves is easy, frictionless, borderless payments, which is a really great thing, but that exists with crypto. The other big problem I think about with fiat currency is the ability to print and print and print and keep making more dollars in the case of the US government or the Fed and just have no consequences. Obviously, there's consequences with inflation and all the different results that come from printing money, but CBDCs don't stop that. It's not like Bitcoin where there's a fixed amount and Bitcoin's not going to change. You would have to have such a large population of people who control the network to actually change the 21 million. It would almost be impossible. With the CBDC, it's the same actors and they can still create more and it doesn't change that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to make sure the listeners got it. Yeah. So Bitcoin, yes, it's a digital currency, but it also, by its very nature, caps out at 21 million, and that can't be altered. Whereas, with a central bank issued digital, it's a digital currency, so it's like Bitcoin in that respect. But it's not that we know ahead of time. Well, dollars are going to peak at this amount, and unless people mine new dollars or something like that, obviously not. The central bank can just say, we're buying this asset, and here's more dollars. This is just a different, and that's actually one of the things George emphasizes. He was worried by everybody recoiling against FedCoin, like thinking a CBDC in the U.S. context would mean this new altcoin issued by either the Treasury or the Fed. And he's saying, no, they're going to keep calling it the dollar. It's just going to, instead of being green pieces of paper, it'll just be a ledger. It's like if everybody had their own checking account with the Fed, the way that the banks do right now. And he's saying that's all it would actually be. And that it would have all the attributes of a CBDC. And yet people wouldn't realize. They would just think, oh yeah, this is, it's online now or something. They wouldn't realize it's online checking. They wouldn't realize, oops, this is a CBDC.
I was in the line at the coffee shop yesterday at one of the breaks, and it was a lineup of rebel capitalists, everyone with the red badges on. And the universal, at the point of sale, when people were buying a coffee or a sandwich or something, and the line was quite long, you could continually hear as people were getting up there, oh, wow, you take cash? Mm-hmm. People were shocked that this hotel that we're at here in Orlando, this resort, was taking cash. And they were all quite complimentary. And you could hear the message kind of worked its way down. They take cash. Psst, they take cash.
I must be out of the loop because I pay for cash for most stuff. Like I at the same place, but it didn't surprise me. Is it a trend in some places of the U.S. now, where at least touristy places?
Okay, so I have to qualify my comment because I just spent the last 3 weeks in Canada.
Okay,
I just spent the last 3 weeks in Toronto before I got back to Florida, and so they don't take cash in many places in Canada anymore. Like there's big signs at all the Starbucks that say cashless. Like
Wow.
big, bold signs.
Huh.
And most places are cashless.
Am I in a boat? Like, do you know what he's talking? Does that sound right to you?
So I don't pay attention because I don't even take my wallet with me most places. I literally
You just
have
scan
Apple Pay.
your finger?
Yeah, exactly. No, I use Apple Pay. So literally I take my phone,
Okay.
I click twice, and it goes right
See,
to my
this is
bank
what
account.
George is talking about. These young kids, they don't even know.
Right.
I'm the
Okay. Well,
Perfect
no, yeah. It
example.
may just
Yeah.
be that because I'm more like in a suburb in Massachusetts, and maybe that's why I haven't experienced it. It probably like in like bigger, more metropolitan urban areas, it's more of a thing.
Right. Yeah. I want to just circle the conversation back to kind of the CBDC thing again a little bit, because I think it's a really important thing. And I think for listeners, it's something to really kind of sink your teeth into because it's a big issue. And one of the things, and I was just thinking about this because I was in Canada and I was thinking about banks and I was thinking about bank failures. And one of the things that George and one of the themes of kind of rebel capitalists in this weekend was one bank. Like what happens, and you see these bank failures and you think about conspiracy theories. We've had 4 major banks fail in the last couple months. So the conspiracy theory is that by design? I mean, is this intentional so that all banks, there's one balance sheet and there's just one bank. And if there's just one bank, then what does that do for their balance sheet? Well, it would suggest that their balance sheet could be as big as they want. I think, Bob, you made the point in one of your talks on the panel that you could take a piece of platinum and put 1 and a T after it, and it's put that into the treasury, and there's $1 trillion all of a sudden out of nowhere.
Oh, yeah. So for people who don't know, that's the context was I was explaining how these academics who can be very intelligent put forth ridiculous ideas. And yeah, in the debt ceiling controversy. So, I mean, it comes up I think it was like 2 or 3 of the quote crises ago. It was when Obama was president, and that some staffer somewhere came up with the idea. He's like, wait a minute, the Constitution gives the Treasury the authority to issue platinum coins. You know, that's some throwaway line in the thing. Or maybe it's a statute based on the constitutional language. I forget which. But actually, it is a statute now that I'm thinking of it. But in the historical context, it was clearly commemorative platinum coins. It wasn't like, and so they said, so we could just take this little disc of platinum, Treasury stamps $1 trillion US, and go deposit it with the Fed and say, add that to our checking account. Right. And they think that's all legal, and let's take it to the Supreme Court. Let's see what happens. You know, that kind of deal. So yeah, that's the kind of crazy stuff they're proposing. And Lynn Alden, you know, we were watching her today. She was explaining how, with the yield curve and the way the Fed is manipulating things, that they're making the banks take the brunt of it right now. That their assets are, a lot of them long-term fixed rate. And so as the yield curve inverted or whatever, they're getting crushed. And that's clearly the consolidation is happening. So whether the design was to do that or whether they realize, I mean, they know full well the result of what they're doing is going to be consolidation. And so my guess is they're doing that. They kind of had to raise rates, given the inflation and what price inflation. So, but I don't think that they're upset about that. I think they want the consolidation, which that would just make sense. If you're rich, powerful people and you have controlling interest in large banks, you would want to knock out your competitors. Why not?
Yeah. And so in the US, there's big banks, there's big regional banks, there's small banks, there's a competitive banking industry. In Canada, there's like 4 banks, 5 banks. There's a few credit unions.
Yeah, that's something is in America. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently the US, for folks who don't know, like has a lot of banks compared to other countries, which I didn't realize until recently.
Right. And if you think about what in Canada, kind of the consensus is that Canadian banks are really, but really the Canadian banks are ultimately really, it's one bank, essentially. It's the central bank that has these 4 different kind of branches that reach out into the market and just kind of act as like really a point of sale for the market. And so you see this happening in Canada, and you see the central banking, the centralized aspect of banking is alive and well. That's why you really don't hear a lot. So what George is talking about is essentially happening kind of just north of the border in a lot of ways. You mentioned Lynn Alden, and I just kind of wanted to point out, if we're going to kind of maybe switch gears a little bit here, she did a remark. If you have any interest in macroeconomics, I'd say this to the listeners, quick Google and we can put something in the show notes about her. But I think she delivered a talk this morning on macroeconomics that I think was pretty digestible. She's a young woman and has a remarkable grip on macroeconomics. I mean, is what she was throwing down this morning, Bob, did it connect?
Oh, yeah. So I had heard her name, but I never saw her talk before.
Yeah.
And George had a great, so George folks had her come, and she was the first talk of the morning. So it was good that because it would have been a lot for people to digest.
Yeah.
And George just They had nice chairs out there, and he just like kind of had a fireside chat as he built it. But yeah, he was just drawing her, and she just had all these statistics and stuff. And well, in Japan, what's going on is this, and da-da-da-da. But then over here, they got this, and in the U.S. in the 1940s, the way they handled this kind of thing was they had interest rates do such and such. So yeah, it was good. Like she had a lot of faith, but also like it seemed like her theoretical foundations, I was largely sympathetic to as well. Because some people come out and they rail off a bunch of statistics, but I get the sense they don't know much about economics. But it seemed like, yeah, she had both. So yeah, I was very interested. And she also is what kind of reinforced the idea to me that, yeah, there's bank consolidation happening again, whether it's by design or just an offshoot of what they're doing for other reasons. But clearly that's happening. And yeah, I thought what she said made perfect sense.
Bob and I were in the green room having breakfast, watching Lynn and George have this, as he described, fireside chat. And then Bob leaned over to me and made a really interesting observation, which was the format of this and of the delivery of this information was really smart on George's end as he organized it, because it was like a Q&A. They were just having a conversation, and it was much more digestible because she was delivering pretty heavy information globally about macroeconomics. Whereas if it was just her on a stage talking, I think even if it was, people were wired on coffee and it was early and they were sharp, there's a glazing over still that can happen. Exactly. So like, again, people listening that are doing events, the formatting of certain information delivered in a certain way like that. So it was really effective to have that Q&A fireside.
Yeah. Also too, because she would say something and then I think he would realize, some people might not realize the significance. And he'd say, what she's saying, folks, is blah, blah, blah. And he would put it in and it kind of just made people, oh, right. So, okay, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Because like, it's not that what she said was unintelligible, but like she might have used some jargon or something that George had to make sure that people got like the significance of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was good. So what do you think about Orlando, Alec?
It's unique. I'm looking outside this window and we see a roller coaster. We're right in the heart of where a lot of business and conferences are done. To me, the impression was always, and I haven't been here in years, but the impression was business and it's Disney and Universal. And so far it's held up to that reputation.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a little anecdote. So a while ago, I was doing consulting. I was kind of in between long-term spots. And I had this project where I was working. It was like these Asian investors who wanted to bring a casino into Orlando. It's like they hired some group and then that person farmed out, they nailed to me. And like, so I was going to do stuff like look at Atlantic City and Las Vegas and just show like, whoa, tax receipts do blah, 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 and just, kind of an economic analysis. And I just, in doing that, I learned like the biggest opponent of legalizing gambling in Orlando was Disney. Because they want it to be real family friendly, and they were worried if Orlando gets this vibe of being seedy and and that would ruin their brand. And so I didn't know that, but it was just for like they don't call it gambling, they call it the gaming industry.
Right. And gaming. Yeah.
And so they were like saying, oh yeah, we hate the mouse. And we're like, it was kind of funny.
Yeah. You could think that a place like Orlando could compete with Vegas like pretty quickly, being on a different coast. And I think Atlantic City tried to do that. It didn't work out so well, but like a place like Orlando would offset. It's like ship off all the kids to Disney and the parents go and play blackjack.
Right. Yeah. Or, in the, like the electronic slot machines and whatever. So yeah, it was, that's exactly what they were saying. And they're, so they had certain, I guess, political figures that were, I wasn't so much in the politics. I was just doing the analysis to just say, well, yeah, here's probably what would happen in terms of job growth and blah, 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 and whatever, property values and this and that. And let's look at, would crime go up? Well, let's see what happened in Atlantic City. Let's see what happened in Vegas and da-da-da. But yeah, I didn't have any idea. But yeah, apparently the Disney, they're just real big on like, no, we do not want that here because it's got to be like, oh no, it's a fun place to take your family, and they're worried.
Well, Florida is interesting because legalized gaming is only available on Seminole land. So were they planning on changing?
Right, that's what they're trying to do. Yeah. I mean, it's like that in a lot of places. That's why, like I went to the Indian reservation to gamble because it's different law.
Yeah.
It was really nice for me to be, as I mentioned, I was in Canada so I spent the last 2 years basically in Bahamas mostly, Miami. My immigration lawyer said, yeah, you need to go back to Canada because of your visa. There was some complications, or I needed to just kind of go back there and organize a few things. So I did that, and I spent 3 weeks, and I've just 2 days ago put my feet back onto Florida soil, and it was really good. I mean, I really appreciate Florida, and it's interesting being at this event because some of the off conversations that you see kind of, again, people in the lobby or in the waiting room or in the line or just at lunch, or a lot of Texans. And I hear kind of a lot of Texans and Floridians kind of going back and forth, which is the better state,
Yeah.
right? There seems to be. And I listen to these arguments on both sides of it, and it seems like both are pretty great states.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when people do think like if someone's relocating for tax reasons, obviously like they're both, no income taxes. So a lot of the reasons for people who are, let's call them liberty minded, and also if they have some money and they're looking to relocate, that, yeah, those Florida and Texas are usually at the top of the list in terms of, various boxes you would check.
I had the pleasure of living in both, but I think that where I lived in both Texas and Florida, it doesn't count. Right, because Austin
yeah.
is, by the way, Austin, great city.
That's a very liberal,
yes,
blue,
but it's
surrounded by red.
It's funny because, it's a lot of transplants, right? It's a lot of people from the Northeast. It's a lot of people from California.
Yeah.
What's interesting is liberal there isn't like liberal in the Northeast. So I'm from Philadelphia as a disclaimer, but I think it's a little less crazy, like lack of a better term. It's a little bit more, I think, nuanced. I think people are more willing to have conversations. I mean, Texas, you can carry around a gun. You don't need to get any sort of permit. They have constitutional carry.
Yeah.
People still live there and move there that are liberal. You know, that aspect
says
is not,
a lot.
It does say a lot.
Yeah.
And then with Miami, I don't even feel like I live in Florida. I feel like I live in Cuba Jr., but not Cuba Gooding Jr., but just Cuba Jr.
Oh, because of the Latin culture.
Oh yeah, well yeah, it's so many Cubans. It's which is great, and I think they're actually like Cubans have a really great perspective on freedom and and liberties, and I really like the way that Miami is governed. I think that the mayor has done a really great job. But yeah, you walk down the street and half of the conversations that you hear aren't in English; they're in Spanish, which I don't have an issue with, other than I don't speak Spanish.
Right.
So sometimes you'll get into an Uber or something and it's a little bit more difficult to communicate. But other than that, it is a great city. I think Florida is a great state. I love that there's no state income tax, and the weather is tremendous. So.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up the conversation. You guys got any other comments you want to make?
Well, I'm going to go to Disney right now. That's where I'm off to. I want to go get fingerprinted.
Yeah, I was going to get your things scanned, and they'll keep track of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Alec, thank you for your inaugural presence on the podcast.
Great job.
We value your contributions.
Absolutely. No, thank you guys for having me. Love the Founders Forum. Great to finally be on it, and hopefully I'll get the opportunity again.
We will just see. You have to earn it.
Yeah,
okay.
Perfect.
Thanks, folks, for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.